Hey, welcome back to Defending Your Faith. If you don't have a workbook, you can grab one. And, of course, download the Shepherd's Global Classroom app at shepherdsglobal.org. My name is Darrell Stetler. Glad to be here with you today. Today we are talking about one of my favorite lessons, the historical reliability of the New Testament. Now, if you recall, that is an incredibly important part of the general argument for Christianity. So I'm just kind of I've left this up here temporarily to show you how we construct that argument and to remind you that what we're doing is breaking down now and examining each piece. All right, so we have the New Testament's historically reliable. Because of that, we can conclude that Jesus fulfilled prophecies and that he raised himself from the dead. And that means that Jesus is who he said he was. He's God. As God, he says, he speaks with infallible authority and says the Bible is from God and he's the only way to God. And we conclude from that Christianity is true. All right, so I'm going to take this down for a moment so it will not be in my way and I won't knock it down. And I want to begin today. We're going to have to really roll through some significant note-taking, all right, for me to get through this in a reasonable time. So here we go. Grab your workbook and let's get started. If the New Testament is not historically reliable, if we don't have that piece, then we are followers of a false religion. I want to emphasize that. I want you to understand that and feel the weight of that question. If we don't have a historically reliable New Testament, then we are followers of a false religion. Because the reliability of the New Testament is critical in Christianity, because Christianity is based on claims about the actions of God in history. We say that God acted in the human story. And so that's why it is crucial that we deal with objections and demonstrate that this piece of the general argument is valid. All right? So let's do that. Let's launch in. Here are some common objections to the historical reliability of the New Testament, and we're going to begin with those. All right? So number one, the New Testament was written 100 to 200 years after the life of Christ. This is what some critics will allege. All right? It's not true. We'll discover why. But it is something that they will allege is true. They will say, well, you can't trust the New Testament. It was written 100 or 200 years after Christ. And so many of the stories in the New Testament, they will say, are myths. They're just fairy tales. They didn't really happen in history. Here's our response, all right? The response is that the New Testament was complete within 60 years of Jesus' life. And that is not enough time for myths to grow up and for the life of Jesus to be distorted into fairy tales. It's not enough time for that to happen. There were still eyewitnesses to the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection and the events of Jesus' life. There were still eyewitnesses around in that time period. So most of the books of the New Testament are completed within 30 years. All right, this is a short enough time span to be within the eyewitness period. All right? What is our evidence for that? Well, let's take a look at it together. First of all, and we have a number of bullet points here, manuscripts have been found from the early 2nd century. That is the 100s AD. In fact, I will show you here a picture that is important for you. This is P45. It is dated, it's a manuscript, a piece of a Greek manuscript. It's dated from 200 to 250 AD, so a couple of hundred years after Christ, and it's fragments of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Acts, these little group of manuscript fragments. So you can see already that there were copies of the New Testament available that early. And then let's continue on. Let's push back the date even further than that. The John Ryland Papyrus. This is the John Ryland Papyrus, and it was discovered in Egypt. So a long ways from where it was written, long ways from where the events took place. And it's a fragment of John 18, 31 through 33. It is, of course, John's Gospel was written about 90 to 95 AD. That's what most conservative scholars would say, that it was written 90 to 95, something like that. The Apostle John was probably the youngest of all of the disciples of Christ. And so by the time that he is very aged, he is still alive, 60 years after the events. And so he is toward the end of his life by that time, and he's writing his gospel. And this papyrus dates from somewhere from 117 to 138, somewhere in that ballpark right there. Let's just say, for the sake of your notes, you can say 125. Just kind of split the difference there and say 125 AD. Now, I want you to notice that it was found in Egypt, right? So for this manuscript to be copied from the original, make its journey and wind up in a resource or in a library or a collection in Egypt, that would have taken some time, and the original had to be even earlier than the 125 that we believe this manuscript was written. This John Ryland's papyrus was written somewhere around 125. So that means the original would have to be even earlier than that. And so just that's a crucial idea. The next thing I want you to point out is that in the New Testament, all but 11 verses can be reconstructed in the writings of the early church fathers between the 2nd and 4th centuries, so between the 100s and the 300s AD. 36,289 quotations from the New Testament in the writings of the church fathers. Ignatius and Clement quote from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the year 100. So you can see already we're pushing this back earlier than the year 100. If Ignatius and Clement are quoting from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that means that those books were already written, they were already in circulation, and were already well known enough to be considered authoritative sources. Does that make sense? The manuscripts must have been written even earlier than the year 100 when they're being quoted by Ignatius and Clement. Now, these are valuable concepts because already we've demonstrated that it simply isn't true that the New Testament was written 200 years after Christ. And frankly, it wasn't even written 100 years after Christ. They're quoting from it 70 years after Christ. Quoting from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John 70 years after Christ. That pushes the writing of those back significantly earlier than the times when they were quoted. Continuing on, I want you to check out the next bullet point. Most of the New Testament must have been finished before 70 AD, since there's no reference to the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Now, the New Testament church early on was very Jewish. Many Jews, right? All the Christ's apostles are Jews. Many of the most influential early Christians are Jewish. Jesus, of course, was Jewish. And Jesus foretold the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. He said there's coming a day where not one stone will be left on top of another at the temple. And that literally happened. Titus came in, they burned the temple, and they literally, because the gold melted and ran down between the stones, they literally took every stone, every one of the great stones of the temple, off of each other and peeled the gold out to take it back as treasure. So you understand that what this means is that would have been a tremendous boost to their credibility. See, Jesus told you, He predicted this. He truly is the Son of God. He predicted this, but it's never mentioned, which most likely means that the New Testament was pretty much completed before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Right? Most of the New Testament was written before that time. If it hadn't been, we would have letters and we would have references to it and we'd have confirmation, but there is no mention of it at all. So it would almost be like, imagine that you wrote a history of England, but you forgot to mention World War II. Right? Nobody would do that. And especially now. If we were writing a history of England right now, we would definitely mention Churchill and World War II and Hitler and all of those things. It would clearly be mentioned. It's that significant. It's that weighty. So the next bullet point on your handout is that the book of Acts and all of Paul's letters were written prior to Paul's death in the mid-60s. So Paul dies somewhere in the mid-60s, maybe 65, 68, something like that. Nero died in 68, and the early church historian Eusebius says that Paul was executed by Nero. So that means Paul had to have been executed before 68, sometime 68 or earlier. And so if that's the case, Paul's letters and his writings clearly had to be written before the year 68. And so Paul is still alive, incidentally, at the end of the book of Acts. So Luke writes his gospel. He writes his Gospel of Luke, and he writes the book of Acts as a companion to it. So I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but they're both addressed to the same person, Theophilus, and so they're written as a companion volume to one another to record the acts of Jesus and the acts of Jesus through the church. And so with that reality in mind, Paul's still alive when Luke is finished writing with Acts, and that means 68. That means that the Gospel of Luke is written earlier, sometime earlier than 68, probably, and obviously earlier than the book of Acts, most likely, right? So it's very, very early. We're getting back well within the eyewitness period. So our conclusion then is that the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses and researchers who talked to eyewitnesses within a few decades of the life of Christ. So all these things were written early on. Most scholars look at the Gospel of Mark and say that Mark was probably the earliest of the Gospels and was written as and was used as kind of source material. Several of the other Gospels appear to quote from Mark and add to it. And so Mark was probably the earliest of those, and so he's clearly written very, very early in the process, very, very close to the time of Christ. Now, the bibliographical test. Let's talk about the bibliographical test, all right? I want to first say that paleography, the word paleography, is the science of dealing with ancient manuscripts and ancient writing. In paleography, which when we're dealing with ancient manuscripts, there are a standard test used on any ancient document to determine how reliable it is historically. Can we trust what is written here? And the test is called the bibliographical test. So paleography deals with ancient manuscripts, and it has a test called the bibliographical test that is very standard. Any ancient document has to stand up to these things. So here's what that means. These are the three parts of the test. First of all is time span. All right, time span. The number of years between the original document when it was written and the earliest surviving copies or manuscripts that we have. So what's that time gap? The shorter the time gap, the more we can trust the manuscripts, right? If it's 1,000 years between when it was written and the copies that we have, I don't know how many times it was copied in the middle there. You know, how many times maybe there were things added or subtracted. So the shorter the time gap, the more we can trust the manuscripts. The second part of the test is number. The number of existing handwritten copies or manuscripts of a document. The larger the number of copies that we have, the more reliable the text is, right? Because if you have only one copy, you don't know maybe if that one was that a good copy or was it one that somebody was really sloppy on. But if you have 100 copies, now you can compare between the 100 copies and see what looks like it was the most reliable reading of the text. In the same way, we do exactly this same process with the New Testament. So I want to show you some slides right now. And I want to demonstrate to you the time gap analysis. So if you take a look at this slide right here, you will see that these are ancient books, documents from the ancient Greek world by people like Aristotle and Herodotus and Plato and Caesar, Tacitus, Homer, Virgil, and comparing the New Testament. I want you to notice that the huge time gap between the existing manuscripts of Aristotle, Herodotus, Plato, Caesar, Tacitus. We're talking about 1,500 years, 900 years, 750 years. In fact, on your handout, I'm going to give you some numbers here. Okay, Plato's Tetralogies, approximately 1,300 years. Caesar's Gallic Wars, approximately 950-year gap. Tacitus, the Annals, Tacitus's Annals, 750 years approximately between the gap between the original and the copies that we have. Homer is the Iliad, and it's about 400 years between the gap between when Homer wrote and the earliest copies that we have. So I want you to notice how significant that is. That's a long time, and yet we do believe that we have the works significantly, substantially, without change. the works of Plato, Caesar, Tacitus, and Homer. We do believe that we have those, even though there's these enormous time gaps. Nobody argues that we don't have what they wrote. And yet the New Testament has a time gap of approximately 150 years between early manuscripts that we have and the original writings. So we already talked about how the original writings are very early to the events, but objection number 2, and I did not give you this blank, so I'm going to give it to you now. Objection number 2 says we can't trust the New Testament because there's too much time between the originals and the earliest surviving copies. So people say, well, it was copied so many times and people changed it and they added stuff and they added stories. That business about Jesus raising the dead or healing the blind, that wasn't really in the original. It was just added later. Well, if the shorter the time gap, the less likely that took place, right? There wasn't enough copies, enough copying to change substantially during that time frame. So 150-year time gap is really, really significant. Now, I want to point out to you another objection. If you're ready to take notes on objection 3, there are too many differences among surviving New Testament manuscripts for us to know what was in the original. This is what some critics say. They allege that there's too many differences. We can't really know what they wrote originally. But here's the response. The response is the vast number of surviving New Testament manuscripts and the small number of conflicts show that we can trust the New Testament. There just aren't very many significant conflicts between the various manuscripts that we have. And we have a vast number of manuscripts. Now, this is demonstrated by the number and the quality aspects of the bibliographical test. So I want to show you that right now. I want to show you some slides. Here is a picture of a manuscript of Caesar's Gallic Wars in the modern day. We have 9 or 10 good copies of Caesar's Gallic War. Now, these copies are dated about 900 years after the events. So we have 9 or 10 copies 900 years approximately after the events that were the writing of all of that. Then we have, here's one about the Roman history by Livy, and 20 copies of that. And we have earliest copies date from the 4th century, or the 300s, all right? So History of Rome, and it is 20 copies. We got 20 copies in 4th century time gap. Here's Tacitus, the Annals of Roman History, and only 2 copies have survived, and that dates from the 9th and 11th centuries, so from the 800s and the 1000s AD. So very small number of copies there. Josephus, the Jewish historian Josephus, 9 Greek manuscripts survived. Copies were written in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, so about a little more than 1,000-year time gap, and only 9 Greek manuscripts survived. Now, the next thing that I want to point out to you, let's go with the best case scenario. Okay, the best case. The best one that we have is Homer's Iliad. All right, so Homer, the Roman author Homer, wrote the Iliad, and he wrote this story, or this book. And we have 643 manuscripts that are about 400 years after the original. So about 400 years after the original. This is by far, by a long shot, the best supported of all the ancient Greek classics. All right. So Homer's Iliad, 400 years after the original is when we have the copies from, and 643 copies that we can compare. Do you think that with a relatively small time gap, like 400 years, and with 643 copies, do you think we can say with any certainty that we have what Homer originally wrote? Oh yeah. Yeah, I would say that's actually really good compared to all the other ancient manuscripts. That's very solid, right? 643 copies and only 400 years between the writing and the copies that we possess. So let's take a look. What about the New Testament, right? What about the New Testament? How many copies of that survived? Well, let's talk about it. Here's a picture. Here's a graph. that shows you some of the stats that I just presented. Plato, Caesar, Livy, Aristotle, Sophocles, I didn't talk about him, but Homer. Here is, this is a graph showing, and I left a blank gap over to the right side for the copies of the New Testament. Now, I want you to keep your eye on that one right there, okay? Keep your eye on that one because that's Homer, and that's the very best one that we have right now. Let's take a look at how Homer stacks up to manuscripts we have of New Testament writings. All right, let's take a look at it. Here we go. That's Homer down there, and that's the New Testament. You see, we have approximately 5,000 New Testament copies. We have 5,000. It's unbelievable. The difference, the gap between, the comparison between what we have in the ancient Greek classics compared to the New Testament, it isn't close. It's not even remotely in the same ballpark. You have 643 copies of Homer with a 400-year time gap. We have 5,000 copies of the New Testament, and the earliest manuscripts, 150, 250, those kind of numbers. Those are the kind of numbers that we have in many places. So we have incredible bibliographical evidence. Does the New Testament stack up well for its historical reliability? Does it stack up well compared to any other book from its time period? Oh yeah, only way better, right? Tremendously better. So it's incredible the amount of evidence that God has left us with. And if you include other languages besides Greek, like Latin and Coptic and things like that, it's actually 25,000 manuscripts. So the New Testament was copied because of the people who adhered to it believed in it so strongly and evangelized so aggressively. It was copied into all of these other languages. It was written in Greek, but copied into Coptic and Latin and other languages. And that's where that's the number of languages if you count manuscripts that were written in other languages. So 25,000, and the number is regularly growing. Now, I wanted to go back to your handout or your workbook. You might notice it says there are 138,000 words in the New Testament. Less than 1% of all of those are disputed. Less than 1% of the words in the New Testament are disputed. It's about 400 words, right? Out of the 138,000 words in the New Testament, there's about 400 words that are disputed as to whether or not they were in the New Testament. All of the other words in the New Testament, all the other changes, people talk about all the errors and copying changes. No, all of the other errors and changes are matters of spelling or grammar. So did this word spell exactly like this word? You know, have you ever noticed that in the UK, in England, or in other parts of the United Kingdom, they will spell a word a little differently than we do. So they'll spell color with an extra U in it, or they'll spell with a word with an S instead of a Z. Like realization, we spell it with a Z, they spell it with an S, right? Or they'll call a lawyer a solicitor, right? And so we'll have some of those kind of changes. The vast majority of the changes, errors in the New Testament, people call them errors even though they're really not, are matters of grammar and spelling and style. And none of them, listen, this is very important, none of them affect any major doctrine of Christianity. None of them. So it's important that you understand that. It's not like, well, if we accept this, we have to change what Christians believe. No, not at all. None of those things happen. Now, I want to ask you, are there contradictions in the Bible? I want to deal with that in just a little bit. Well, let me go to objection 4 and give that to you. All right, so we'll give you objection 4, and then we'll talk about contradictions. So objection 4 says we cannot trust the authors of the New Testament to record reliably, accurately, the events that happened. They are not reliable witnesses. So some people would argue this is true. This is an objection that some people have. Here's our response. The internal evidence and external evidence tests show that the New Testament is a historically reliable record. What are the internal evidence and external evidence tests? Let me give you those blanks, all right? The external evidence test asks this: can we find external sources of truth and information that confirm or verify the accounts as they were written? Can we find external sources of truth or information? Do other people mention Jesus? Do other people talk about something that he did? Do other people, either friends or enemies, do they talk about what Christ has done? And so those are external evidence. And then the internal evidence test says, deals with the question, can we trust the authors? Can we trust what they wrote? Do they appear to be honest, careful, and competent? So do they appear to be speaking the truth? Do they appear to be careful and detail-oriented? Or do they appear to be writing clearly in hyperbole, just making stuff up? Or sloppy in their history, or sloppy in their geography, or those kinds of things. So external evidence test, internal evidence test. I want to cover several of those with you right now. Let's talk about the internal evidence of the Gospels, all right? The Gospels claim to be written by eyewitnesses and those who knew them, all right? So that's a claim that they make. There's references there for you. Many of the witnesses of these events were still living, including enemies, critics, who would have loved to discredit the authors, right? They would have loved to discredit them. So the Jews and the Romans, many of them would have loved to discredit the authors. They were still alive. If they could have brought out the body, they would have brought out the body, right? So there's lots of eyewitnesses, positive and negative, that were still living. Thirdly, the historians of the New Testament were extremely careful and competent in their details. Luke mentions about 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands. And Sir William Ramsay, the famous British archaeologist, concludes that his geography and his writing, so Luke's writing about his geography and his writing in Luke, or in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts, where he talks in a lot of detail about travel and all those things, were accurate in every case that he studied. Was there an ancient city to that? There was. Was it where he said it was? Yes, it was where he said it was. He always concluded that Luke was correct. And Ramsay was a very well-known and influential archaeologist. Number 4, the authors of the New Testament died for their faith. They died for their faith. Many of them were tortured, they were imprisoned, they were executed, and yet they maintained their faith in Christ. So this is a really significant question, because there's a man named Chuck Colson who wrote brilliantly about this. Chuck Colson was a man who worked with Richard Nixon, a U.S. president, who was corrupt and who was involved in a cover-up. There were only a few people who knew about the cover-up, but as soon as one of them was caught, he squealed on all the rest to save his own skin, right, to get out of it. Colson was actually sent to prison. Chuck Colson was actually sent to prison because of his role in the Watergate scandal and cover-up in the Nixon administration. In that prison, he studied the evidence for Christianity, and he became a Christian. And here's why he said he became a Christian. He said, I saw that all of these men died for what they believed. And he said, the truth is, it had to be true. They did see Christ. They did see him rise from the dead. Because he said, nobody would have willingly died for what they believed was a lie like that. Nobody would have. He said, we couldn't even keep Watergate together for a week. We couldn't even keep it secret for a month with just a few people who knew the lie. We couldn't keep it a secret, because as soon as it was advantageous for one of them to to squeal on the others, they did it to save their own skin. And yet, apostle after apostle after apostle died for what they believed. They gave up their lives and laid it down and never denied. Why is that? Here's why. Because they're reliable. It's part of the internal evidence test. All right. Let's talk about contradictions in the Bible. Are you familiar with the law of non-contradiction? It's a logical law that says a statement cannot both be true and not true at the same time in the same sense. All right. So that's the law of non-contradiction. So there are many things that seem to be contradictory, but actually are not. They are only apparent contradictions. There can be things in regular human conversation. So if you met two people from the same family, and one of them said to you, I saw a blue car in an accident in front of my house today. And then another person in that family said, I saw a red car in an accident in front of my house today. That seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Right? It seems like oh my, that's a contradiction. Oh my, there must be somebody's lying. Now, the question is it an apparent contradiction or a real contradiction? Because is there any way to harmonize the two? That both could be true? Well, yes, right? It could be that a red car hit a blue car in front of their house, and they only told you about the red car or the blue car. They only made a partial statement, and there was more truth about that they didn't mention. So they didn't contradict each other. It's only an apparent contradiction. Now, I want to say that many things in the Bible that people or critics call contradictions are actually not when you study them out. When you further explain them, they're not actual contradictions. They were only apparent contradictions, such as Matthew says there was an angel at the tomb, and Luke mentions there were 2 angels at the tomb. Now, did Matthew say there was only one angel, or did he just say there was an angel? Well, if he has said there was only one angel at the tomb, and Luke says there are 2 angels at the tomb, that would be a contradiction. However, when you start thinking about it and studying about it, well, actually, Matthew just mentions one, and Luke happens to mention that there were 2. So, no contradiction there. There are many other examples of that, which I won't take time to go into because this lesson is very long. All right? Let's continue on, and let's talk about the external evidence test. All right? First of all, the external evidence, what does it teach us about the New Testament? Early Christian writers bear witness to the Gospels. Okay? Early Christian writers bear witness to the Gospels. So there are other people outside the New Testament that talk about it. Papias, who was a disciple of the Apostle John, wrote that John said the Gospel of Mark was based on Simon Peter's memories of Jesus' life and ministry. So, in other words, John Mark was with Peter. He was kind of like the personal secretary of Peter, if you will. And he wrote down Peter's memories. He asked Peter, so tell me what you saw. And he writes it down, he organizes it, and becomes the Gospel of Mark. So Papias writes about Peter and Mark and says this is how that happened. It's an external witness, not a person in the New Testament, but a person who wrote about it and said, I talked to the people involved, and here's what they said. Right? So Irenaeus, in approximately the year 150 A.D., wrote, so firm is the ground upon which these Gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them, and starting from these documents, each one of them endeavors to establish his own particular document. In other words, even the enemies of the Christian church, even the enemies of the gospel, recognize that this is so reliable, they start there to try to prove their errors and prove wrong Christianity and build their own ideas. So you see that there are many external witnesses to the New Testament. Secondly, outside sources refer to the New Testament. And I'm just going to kind of briefly cover these. A letter from Pliny the Younger to who was governor of Bithynia, to Emperor Trajan in AD 112. He talks about it. The writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian, he talks about it. Tacitus mentions it. Lucian, a Greek writer from the 2nd century. Suetonius, a Roman historian. The Talmud, which is the Jewish commentary on the law of Moses, mentions the New Testament, or mentions the events of and the people in the New Testament. So a lot of sources, here's what they confirm. These outside sources. So if we never had anything from the New Testament, just from those external sources, here's what we would have, the picture we would have. We would have the picture that Jesus, a man named Jesus, was crucified under Pontius Pilate at the Passover. Multiple people mention that. His disciples believed that he rose from the dead 3 days later. That's what Josephus mentions. Jewish leaders accused Jesus of doing magic. That's what the Talmud says. Isn't that fascinating? What does that sound like? Miracles, right? So we would see that picture even if we didn't have the New Testament. Christianity spread to Rome. Tacitus and Suetonius mention this. Nero and other Roman rulers persecuted and martyred early Christians. Tacitus mentions that, which is confirming the book of Acts and the persecution and things like that. Christians, we would also know that Christians denied polytheism. They lived according to the teachings of Jesus Christ, and that they worshipped Him. This is all mentioned. These are all things that outside sources confirm. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like the bulk of the core concepts confirmed of the New Testament, doesn't it? I think that's very significant. Very significant. That's significant external evidence. So here is our conclusion, all right? Our conclusion is this. You may choose to believe the claims of the New Testament, or you may choose to reject them. You could go either way. But you can't deny that the New Testament is a reliable historical document. There's far greater evidence for that book than there is for any other writing of the ancient world. That's our conclusion. So again, we're constructing a general argument for Christianity. We're starting with shared values, shared truth, shared ways of coming to the truth. And we're saying, this is a historically reliable document. You should accept what is in it as something that actually happened. So if that's the case, it starts with a cultural connection point and progresses on to there. Like I talked about last time, Paul in Acts 17, the Jews in Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches to them and use a shared cultural connection point. Next time we're going to launch into studying the messianic prophecies of the resurrection, but for today, that's where I wanted to get you to today, to help you understand that this is a historically reliable document. We can hold this book in our hands and say with confidence that we hold a historically reliable record of events that actually happened in human history. Now, the next conclusions are up to the rest of the argument that we build, and we're going to continue that next time. I'll see you then. Thanks for being here today.